Welcome to Curiousaholic, the show where we question the past and imagine the future, where we learn from people's stories, learn from history's lessons, and unveil some of the dangers that lie ahead in the future. And today we're definitely going to be learning from history's lessons. We're going to be speaking to Rebecca Bratspies, who is a law professor at CUNY School of Law in New York. She is the founding director of the Center for Urban Environmental Reform. She's an internationally recognized expert on environmental justice, the regulation of new agricultural technologies, and the human right to a healthy environment. She has written a book called Naming Gotham, and we're going to be pretty much diving into the book and understanding some of the namesakes for certain landmarks in New York. So you're going to see that, not all the names are necessarily just a given. It's important to ponder on these names.
Yeah, we definitely had an interesting discussion with her, some of the names. So for those who live in New York City, this is for you guys. Hope you guys learn from some of the origin stories of the names that you have come to accept and use day to day. So yeah, I think this was a good discussion.
And today we're going to be primarily focusing on Rikers Island.
Yeah. Mainly Rikers Island, which is a notorious island.
Yeah, and you're going to see, Richard Rikers is the villain in this discussion, so we're going to definitely be talking about him.
Yeah.
Right, so hope you enjoyed the conversation. Leave a comment and tell us what you think if you want to see more of this kind of content.
All right, catch you guys on the next one.
So, Rebecca, what makes you love New York City as much as you do?
The best thing about New York City is that we all make it together. People come here from all over the world. They speak every language. They bring their cuisine with them. And we all live on top of each other and get to know each other and build something different than we would have built without all of those people from all of those places speaking all of those languages. And I think that's incredible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. So you like the diversity aspect of the city. Interesting. Yeah. So can you tell us a story on how you got interested in the history of New York City?
Sure. So the book actually has sort of a funny story. It started in a traffic jam. So I used to go visit my parents in Pennsylvania. And in order to get out of New York City from where I live, I had to take a road called the Major Deegan Expressway. And anybody who ever has to take the Major Deegan Expressway knows that what that means is you're stuck in traffic for hours. It's the road that goes right by Yankee Stadium, and it's always a traffic jam. And the interesting thing was, I'm taking it to go to the George Washington Bridge. Everybody knows who George Washington is. No one had a clue who Major Deegan was. And I used to just fume in traffic and be like, I hate this guy. Who was he? And nobody knew. And finally, my family got sick of hearing me say that, and they just challenged me to find out. So I did. And it turned out he was way less impressive than you might expect, given that he had this major road named after him. But it got me interested in who are all of these people that we've named our infrastructure after and have completely forgotten that the names of the roads and bridges are actually people's names.
So yeah, I guess sometimes we, assign these names to these cultural landmarks without thinking of the good or the bad, that these people might have done in their lives, right? So I think it is really interesting that you did the activity to actually do all the research behind all these people that we attribute to these landmarks.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I love doing that kind of research, and it's, I'm a law professor, so I research for a living, though the research that I do is much more scholarly usually. But this was really fun. I was reading newspaper articles and relying on sort of gossipy reports. So I had a great time.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. So we heard that you wrote this book during, a quite difficult time in your life. Can you tell us about that time? What does this book mean to you?
Yeah, so this book was born in crisis and finished in crisis. I started the book when my husband had a cardiac arrest, and he spent about a month hanging between life and death in the hospital, and then another 5 months in acute rehab learning how to speak and walk and eat and all of the things that we take for granted as able-bodied people. And I was there with him every day. And I needed something to do because I was there. I was in the hospital all day. I needed something to do. I didn't have the emotional bandwidth to do my usual research. But this was, as I said, it's fun. It was easier. It was less weighty. The fate of the world didn't hinge on who the Bruckner Expressway was named after, the way like my research on climate change feels a lot more important in terms of, the fate of the world. Not to be grandiose or anything. And then I finished it during COVID. So I live in a part of New York City that was really hard hit. We live very close to one of the hospitals that had morgues on the street. And there were sirens 24/7. And once again, I needed an escape. I needed something that was lighthearted and fun. And this research and this book provided that for me.
That's great. It's a great outlet for sure. If I may ask, how is your husband now?
Thank you for asking. He's good. He still has significant limitations. He had a pretty significant brain injury, but he's a composer and he's actually back to writing music. So, he's.
That's great. Yeah, good to hear.
Yeah.
So he has his own creative outlet to be able to deal with his problem. Yeah. In your book, you talk about different, streets, landmarks, and different places, and how they each got their name. And today, we wanted to focus on one of them, which is a notorious place, the Rikers Island, being this island that's just dedicated to correctional and mental institutions, and is very known for, the violence that goes on on that island. But before we talk about what it is today, could you give us, a little bit about the history and how it got its name?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So I just want to say that the book, right, is called Naming Gotham, the villains, rogues, and heroes behind New York place names. And the villain in particular, the biggest villain in the book, is Richard Riker. So Rikers Island was traditional territory of the Lenape Indians. And in one of his last acts, before the British sailed into the harbor and captured New Netherlands, Governor Stuyvesant, who was the Dutch governor, granted Rikers Island to a Dutch settler family called the Van Rykens. And the Van Rykens were very much a sort of go with the flow, make it work for you kind of family. So once the English took over, they anglicized their name to Riker. And they were a slaveholding family. They made a fortune out of the enslaved labor of other people. And they then, after the Revolutionary War, parlayed that fortune into social and political prominence. One of the members of the family represented New York in Congress. And Richard Riker, who's, as I said, the villain of the book, he became first the district attorney for New York, and then the recorder, which is a municipal judge. So he was the judge for New York City. And it was about the 1830s, and one of his tasks as municipal judge was enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act, which is returning people who had liberated themselves from slavery back to their enslavers. And he was a very eager participant in this process. And in fact, not only did he happily and frequently find that people were fugitive slaves and return them to their enslavers, but he also was part of what came to be known as the Kidnapping Club, which was a scheme between Riker, the police chief, and a couple of other prominent officials to grab random black New Yorkers off the street, deny them their right of habeas corpus, to prove that they were in fact free citizens of the state of New York, and sell them into slavery. It's villainy at the highest scale.
Wow. Yeah, no, definitely what he did was not right. I just want to understand, so Richard Riker, being one of the descendants of the Riker family in the early 1800s, so he was the first DA of NYC, and then the city recorder, which is like a municipal judge. So just to understand, isn't that like a conflict of interest, being the prosecutor and...
Oh, he did one and then the other. So it was a sequence. He didn't do them both at the same time.
Okay.
Yes, that would be a real conflict of interest.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. But yeah, still during his positions, he enforce that rule of taking free black people and declaring them as fugitives. And so we see that they have. He also owned a slave himself. I think at one point he had a personal slave.
Yes, he was an enslaver. He had a black person that he enslaved. Interestingly, as the recorder, one of his jobs was also signing manumission certificates. So as New York was ending chattel slavery, it didn't end until, I'm terrible with dates, but I think 1827. But as it was sort of tailing down, people were freeing those they had enslaved, and so as recorder, he would sign the certificates. So he was well aware that a lot of the people that were being captured were not enslaved, because he was deeply involved in this on all sides.
So he had this scheme going on of trying to capture them and making sure that they go back into the slavery instead of being free.
Well, I just want to say, for some people, it was going back into slavery because they had liberated themselves and escaped to New York. But for other people, it was just enslaving them because they were free people. They had never been slaves.
Oh, yeah. Wow. Okay, yeah, that is sad, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess during this era, right, this slavery was such a big problem in society, right? I know in that part of the U.S. as well. So, we should consider ourselves lucky not to have to deal with that type of thing today, right? I mean, I'm sure it's not entirely gone and abolished, but well,
we're living with the legacies, that's for sure.
Yeah, for sure. We definitely don't have to deal with that kind of trouble anymore.
Yeah. So the island belonged to that family, right? And then I think, if I remember reading, it was in the early 1900s that the city of New York bought the island.
Yeah. The late 1800s, the city of New York bought the island to turn it into a jail. Because they had a jail on an island called Ward's Island, and that was also where they had, among other things, what was at the time called an insane asylum. And neither facility was very good, and so the idea was that with Rikers Island, they could build a new facility. And part of the plan was that the island, when New York bought it, was 87 acres. And they realized that they could use trash and coal ash from Manhattan, which they were looking for a place to dump anyway. They could use it to build out the island because there are a lot of rock outcroppings around the island. And now the island is 413 acres. Almost all of that is, except for the original 87 acres, is built out of trash and coal ash. And it was done by forced prison labor.
So almost more than quadrupled in its size.
Yeah,
that's immense.
So let me get this right. So they were having some of the prisoners from the island were basically used as labor to expand the island itself. Wow.
And in fact, they touted that as it was a cost saving because they wouldn't no longer have to pay for disposing of the coal ash, and they wouldn't have to pay for the labor of building out the island. So this was the way the officials described it in the plan. It was win-win for us.
Yeah, that sounds pretty nefarious and evil.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. I think there was already enough chaos going on that island, right, with all the violence and all, and then they used the prisoners to practically create the rest of the island, which is pretty wild
to create
the
place that they're gonna stay at.
Yeah,
it's
crazy.
It's twisted.
Wow.
Okay, so the city bought the island, and they kept the name Rikers. And I don't think they didn't know what the Riker family was, or some of the stuff that they were involved in. Could they have renamed it possibly? Why did they just accept it as is?
Well, the interesting thing about, first of all, Richard Riker was, he was a hero in white New York. That's one of the really interesting things about both the history of Rikers Island and the current day experience on Rikers Island, is that while black New York viewed him as a lawless menace because they were afraid of being kidnapped and sold into slavery, white New York thought he was a courtly and gentlemanly man. And in fact, they wrote poems about him. He was a very high profile, high society person. So, and of course, it was white people making the decisions. And so there was no sense of maybe we should change the name. And then when we look at the experience on Rikers Island now, the overwhelming majority of people who are sent there are black. And Latinx, but mostly it is black people from 5 or 6 heavily over-policed neighborhoods. And in the last decade, New York was found to be engaging in unconstitutional practices in terms of stopping black New Yorkers and harassing them and arresting them without cause, and then sending them to Rikers Island. Now, almost everybody held at Rikers Island is a pretrial detainee. So they are people who haven't actually been convicted of anything. They're people who are too poor to make bail for the most part.
Yeah, that's what I heard when I was researching kind of the current times, how it is. It's a lot of just people awaiting trial.
Yeah.
And they live in such, bad circumstances. And yeah, I just find it ridiculous.
Yeah.
And that a lot of the population is of black descent. So it's almost like echoes kind of the past of how, Richard Riker and, what he was doing then.
And a lot of the people working on the island too, right, are saying that the conditions are pretty awful there.
They're abysmal.
The staff, yeah.
They're terrible conditions. I mean, there's so much violence there. The buildings are falling apart. There isn't necessarily air conditioning. There isn't necessarily heat. The plumbing doesn't always work. I mean, terrible conditions. And again, these are pretrial detainees. These are not people who have been convicted and sentenced to anything. It's also really hard to get to Rikers Island. There's only one bridge that connects it to the rest of Queens. So if you are being held as a pretrial detainee on Rikers Island, it's really hard for your family to come visit you.
Yeah, I saw the way it was built there. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just want to come back on something you said before. So you mentioned that for some white people, the Rikers were considered heroes. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is?
They were very much part of the social elite in New York. And had been for a really long time.
Okay. So I guess even with their past and, some of the slave trade that they were doing, they didn't really care about that, right? Back then, I guess it wasn't in their moral compass, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there were plenty of people at the time who objected to slavery as an abomination. One of the other people in the book is a Polish man named Kosciuszko. There's a bridge that connects Queens and Brooklyn called the Kosciuszko Bridge. It's named after him. He was a hero in the Revolutionary War. And what really caught my interest about him was that he was an ardent opponent of slavery in the 1700s.
Okay, yeah. So there were some people who were against, but I guess kind of in their time, it was something that was accepted for a lot of people, like to persecute black people or.
Yeah, well, I mean, just like now, a lot of New York had no idea that stop and frisk was happening and these constitutional abuses were happening, or what the conditions are on Rikers Island, because it's very easy to segment parts of the population and not really understand what's happening.
Yeah,
true. Yeah, they live in like their own bubble and they don't see really what's going on.
Yeah, so I guess this kind of ties into my next question. Do you think we sometimes glamorize certain people even though we think they shouldn't deserve it?
Yes. Yes, I do. And, I think that's something that we're struggling with, across the United States now and really across the world is what do we do about people who we have valorized who are really complicated and have extremely ugly parts of their history. I think that is a question that all of us are trying to navigate. It comes out in my book because the book's about things that people are, things that are named after people. But we see it in, universities talking about whether they should rename themselves. We see it about monuments in the United States, in England, and in many, many places.
Yeah. I guess sometimes, we tend to do that, right? Glamorize people just because they have a certain position in power, right? Like, for example, like politicians or celebrities, right? We always take it for fact that they're the best people, but
rich people, right?
Right, the rich people, exactly. Yeah, you said it right. So I guess it is important to kind of do like the activity you did to do the research behind these namesakes and try to understand, who are these people really.
The origin stories, yeah. It's
Yeah.
important.
Yeah.
It's always good to know our history.
Yeah, and I feel like framing it in terms of individuals and their lives is a really accessible way into our history, because these people they got divorced, they had love affairs, they had businesses, they had children. It makes it more tangible somehow, and I think easier to learn maybe.
Yeah, because people can relate better to the stories
Yeah.
instead of just, this is what happened and this is how it kind of became.
Yeah. I know, like here in Canada, right? Like recently we saw the news that Justin Trudeau got divorced, and just that, it was like everyone was talking about it. But it's like he's a person too, It's like,
Yeah, it almost
just because,
seems untouchable,
Yeah.
or like invincible.
Yeah. Right.
This could not happen to
Yeah.
him, yeah.
yeah, just because he's in a position of power doesn't mean like stuff happens in life.
Yeah.
He also has his life. Just a question kind of relating to how we glamorize people, and we also name places after people.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say against the argument where people are like, well, good or bad, this was our history and we shouldn't erase part of it because we think it's not right or not good? Because there are some issues that happen in the U.S. where statues people wanted to take down or change names, and they were saying, why should we remember this person who was X, Y, and Z? And what would you say to that argument?
Well, I think it depends somewhat on how and when the honoring of the person happened. A lot of the statues that are being sort of challenged in the United States right now were put up in the 1920s and the 1950s as a direct rejection of civil rights. So, I feel like a statue of, say, a statue of Robert E. Lee, who was the main general of the Confederacy. If one had been put up at the time of the Confederacy, I think you look at that a little differently than one that was put up in 1950, because it's sending a different message to the wider world about who we are and what our story is. But the thing that I really learned about history writing this is that whoever has power gets to decide what counts as history. And the story is always way more complex, and there are always way more actors that could and maybe should have had things named after them. So, reconsidering who we name things after isn't necessarily rejecting our history. It's recognizing the complexity of our history and maybe trying to better capture it for ourselves and the future.
That's good, yeah.
Yeah, so like who takes care of, naming these places? Should there be like a process, maybe some kind of vote, or should there be always this kind of like regulatory body that takes care of naming them?
Well, it depends on what it is. There are processes. So in New York, if it's a highway, for example, then it is the state legislature that would have to name it. And if it is something within the city, then city council can name it or rename it. For example, JFK Airport, right, the big airport here in New York, it was named probably the fastest naming ever. 2 weeks after President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, the airport had been renamed in his honor. City council had passed a resolution, the mayor had signed it, and it was a fact. After Joe DiMaggio died, right, the baseball player, the governor of New York suggested renaming the Major Deegan Expressway to honor Joe DiMaggio because it goes right past Yankee Stadium, as I said. And there was tremendous pushback, and it didn't happen. But it was something that the state legislature could have voted on and done, and then if the governor signed it, it would have happened. So there is a process now. There didn't necessarily used to be so much process, but now there are pretty clear processes for naming things, at least in New York. I assume that's true in other places, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah, we could stick to New York in this case, since we're mainly addressing that. Yeah, okay, so that's interesting. So there is a process involved.
But so in that process, do they take into account what people think or what the population would like? Is there some sort of vote as to what the population wants?
Not necessarily. It's a representative democracy kind of thing. The assumption is that the elected officials are capturing what the people want. There is another process in New York that I think is really interesting, and that is secondary street names. So every street has an official name, but a lot of streets or corners or blocks have a secondary honorific name honoring somebody local in the area. And that is a process where if 200 people sign a petition, the request goes to city council, and city council can make a decision yes or no, and I think almost always says yes.
So why do you think the people simply accept these namesakes for what they are? Is that kind of like a reflection on us, right? That we're not introspective of ourselves and in our society, how it works, and we just kind of take everything for a given or a fact?
I think it's a combination. I do think that people are busy and they're not particularly reflexive, and they don't really want to have to think hard, big thoughts. But also, people forget that these are named after people. There's one great example here in New York. There's a bridge called the Outer Bridge Crossing. And everybody assumes that it's called the Outer Bridge Crossing because it's one of the outermost bridges in New York. But actually, it was named after a guy named Outerbridge. His name was Eugenius Outerbridge, and he was a really important figure in the creation of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Okay. So, I think it's a combination. I think that people just forget that the Holland Tunnel was named after Clifford Holland, that the Bruckner Expressway was named after Henry Bruckner, that Major Deegan was a person, Major William Deegan. I think it instead of names, they've just become words.
And that's the thing, we don't realize how when we name something, it's almost like permanent, and it kind of defines that.
Yeah.
But then we never understand. Okay, but why is it that? Why do we just accept it and not really look into its past and see, should it be that way?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. So we're talking about all these landmarks in New York City. Mm-hmm. Have you ever wondered where New York City gets its nickname, the Big Apple?
Yeah.
I know why it's called Gotham City. I did know why it was called the Big Apple, but I can't remember off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
That's okay. No worries.
Okay.
You want to maybe look that up?
Sure. I know during my research when I was doing,
I forget.
It said it was something about a sports magazine or.
Okay, so maybe there's no real reason for it to be called the Big Apple, and it's just kind of like a nickname we give it.
I think there is a name that comes from I think the 1920s or so, but I think Gotham is a more interesting story about nickname for New York. Most people know Gotham because of Batman.
Batman, yeah.
But
maybe explain why it's called.
So in the 1800s, there was a pretty famous American author called Washington Irving. He wrote a number of stories, and he lived in New York City, and he was like a bit of a lad. He was very high profile, somewhat of an Oscar Wilde kind of character maybe, and he and his friends would sort of roam around the city drinking and being boisterous, and they made a satirical magazine about New York society. And they called it Gotham because Gotham is a word that comes from Middle English, and it means goat herder. But it also was a slur at the time that meant city of fools. So in their satirical magazine, they were writing about Gotham, basically calling all of the people around them idiots.
That's funny. Well, I never knew that. That's
New York,
interesting.
The city of fools. Interesting.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, so it's important, I guess, to also think about the city itself, right? Because right now we're focusing on these little cultural landmarks, but I guess the city also has meaning as well.
The names, yeah. I mean, I looked it up here. If I could quickly share this screen and we can have a look at it here. On Google, it's saying that it began in the 1920s when a sports journalist, John F. Fitzgerald, wrote a column for the New York Morning Telegraph about the many horse races and racecourses in and around New York. He referred to the substantial prizes to be won as the Big Apple, symbolizing the biggest and best one can achieve.
Interesting.
Yeah, I knew it came from the 20s, but I didn't remember exactly where.
Where exactly? Yeah. I think then
Yeah.
people just picked that up and then kept calling it.
Yeah, they just they attributed a nickname to it, right? That's interesting.
Interesting.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, because I always heard people call it the Big Apple, but I never knew why. That's kind of why I asked the question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, also going back to the Rikers Island, kind of the current day situation. So we know the prisons and the violence that's going around. Kind of, what more do you know about what happens there, and what is the situation, and what are your thoughts?
So there was a very successful campaign led by people who had formerly been incarcerated on Rikers Island under the hashtag Close Rikers. And City Council in 2017 enacted legislation, and the mayor signed it, to close Rikers Island in 2026 and to shut the jail down entirely. And that got pushed back a year because of COVID, but by law, the jail has to shut in 2027. And right now, a federal judge is trying to decide whether or not to put the jail into receivership because it's being so poorly managed by the city, and so many people have died there, and there's the conditions are so bad. We should get that decision pretty much any day. I think it might happen, but the jail for sure has to close in the next couple of years. And then when it does, there's a proposal that I'm really involved with called Renewable Rikers, which is to take the island and turn it into renewable energy generation and storage and wastewater treatment, and then remove polluting infrastructure from the communities that were most impacted by mass incarceration on Rikers Island, and improve the quality of life in those communities.
Yeah, that could be really cool because it's on its own island. So all of that stuff with renewable energy and waste management could free up the space, since New York is so dense, and you know every inch of it is very valuable.
Yeah. So, like, how would you, that's quite a change, right? From the, the prison, all the prisons that are there right now to like this new project with renewable energy. How long would this, project last? How big a project are we talking about here?
Well, in 2021, City Council passed a series of 3 laws that collectively are known as Renewable Rikers, and that required the city to, first of all, turn over land as it stops being used to incarcerate people, to turn it over from the Department of Corrections to another agency within the city government. And some of that has happened. The current mayor has really not done his job complying with that law, but some of it happened under the prior mayor. And then the other 2 laws are about investigating wastewater treatment on the island and renewable energy generation. And the good news is that the plans for renewable energy generation on Rikers Island have been wrapped into the city's plans for how to decarbonize our electricity sector. So that is, the city is planning on doing that as part of its process. And the feasibility study about the wastewater treatment stuff should be out this fall, I think. So, we have 3.5 years until the jail shuts. And I keep saying jail because a jail is where you hold people who haven't been convicted of anything. A prison is where you put convicted people go into a prison. And once the jail shuts, it'll take another couple of years to build the infrastructure, but they could start building that infrastructure now on the parts that have been transferred away from the Department of Corrections.
I see.
Interesting.
So, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I was going to say, there was recent news about Mayor Adams, reconsidering the closure of Rikers Island and kind of putting it into question, and him saying, well, what's going to happen? All these thousands of prisoners, they're just going to go back into our cities and societies. I mean, is that true? Like, they're just not going to be held somewhere else? Or what about the cost that they say associated with building local jails in the boroughs?
Well, right now it costs us $500,000 a year per person on Rikers Island. Wow. Supportive housing costs about $50,000 per person. So, channeling some of that money away from the Department of Corrections towards social support and services could have a tremendous impact. But the thing to remember is that most people being held on Rikers Island are just being held pre-trial because they can't afford bail. So, it's not the crisis to not hold people pre-trial. Most people we found that most people who are released without bail show up for their trial. And in New York, the only legal reason to impose bail is to make sure that people show up for trial. So, there are some people who are being held for safety reasons. There are some crimes that you can't be released pre-trial, but that's not thousands of people. So the plan to replace Rikers Island with a series of smaller, modern, borough-based jails so that not everybody is in this penal colony in Queens that is really far from the courts, but are being held close to the courts and close to social services, will hopefully make a real difference in reducing the need for these services in the first place.
Yeah, so to avoid all this, violence and chaos that was happening on this island, do you think there should have been some kind of, prison or, in this case, jail reform to, avoid all these issues happening there?
Oh, yeah. Yes. I mean, the management is shockingly derelict in its duty. And also, even during COVID, when the disease was running rife through Rikers Island, DAs kept demanding bail and judges kept imposing bail. I think there needs to be a more individualized sense of, do we really need bail? Especially, you're talking about people who are poor. When they're incarcerated on Rikers Island, they lose their jobs. Their family ties are strained. It creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of problem.
Just a cascading effect of just issues.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. And I hear also a lot of the inmates there are for petty crimes or drug possession or which often is the case in a lot of American prisons. It's just they had some marijuana on them or something like that. Not really serious crimes.
Though we legalized marijuana in New York, so
Oh, you did?
those people are not being arrested for that anymore. Thank goodness.
Okay. Yeah, at least, yeah.
When did that pass? I wasn't aware of that.
Very recently.
Wow.
It just came into effect in 1 or 2 years ago.
Interesting.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
So that's just in New York. It's in the state of New York?
State of New York.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Wow,
So
that's
there
interesting.
are a handful of states where that has at a minimum decriminalized, but many have legalized marijuana. I think Maryland, definitely Colorado, Washington State, I think California.
Yeah. We're in Canada, and back in 2018 became legal in Canada as well. So
like the whole country, yeah.
yeah. Have you thought of any other maybe names that maybe you want people to know about that we don't talk about necessarily that much? Like, for example, there's the World Trade Center, right? That has a new name, the One World Trade. Have you looked into that a little bit, how they got to that name, or is that something outside of your scope?
Well, I was really looking at things that were named after people. And obviously, World Trade Center is not named after people. But when they rebuilt after 9/11, there was no question that it was going to be, they were going to rename it something that was very close to the original name, but not the same. Because, for purposes of remembering, but also recognizing sort of transition and change, they didn't want to rename it the World Trade Center. But One World Trade is what they came up with.
Yeah. I mean, we know that there's a lot of landmarks that are very known in the city, like the Statue of Liberty or Empire State Building. So not all of them have been named after people, but it seems like we always have this fascination of wanting to give people's names from history. So is there do they decide like, okay, do we go after a person's name? Like, do we give a person's name or do we give some other name? And is there a significance between one or the other?
I think it's fairly happenstance. I don't think it's planned the way you're saying that. Like the Empire State Building was named after the Empire Company, which built the building.
Okay.
Ellis Island, which if you come to New York and you go to the Statue of Liberty, the boat goes to the Statue of Liberty and then to Ellis Island. Ellis Island is named after. It's actually not that interesting a guy. I didn't put him in the book, but it's named after someone named Ellis. Some of the names are just who owned it a long time ago.
Okay.
Particularly we see that for islands or for neighborhoods. When you're talking about roads or bridges or monuments or cultural things like Shea Stadium, which is where the Mets used to play until the stadium was raised, right? That was named after William Shea, who was the guy who was instrumental in bringing the Mets to New York. The Billie Jean King Stadium, which is where the U.S. Open is being played right now. Obviously named for famous tennis player and really trailblazer Billie Jean King.
Okay.
Interesting, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so it happens kind of just in the context of when it's being built by who and kind of who owned it. Okay.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And there's a difference.
I guess not. Yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say there's a difference between things that are built privately and things that are built publicly. Like a lot of museums are named after the person who built and founded the museum. The Whitney Museum, the Guggenheim Museum, the Frick Museum. They're all named after the super wealthy people who started the museums. So that's one set of naming. And then there's the set of naming that's about honoring people. And now it's very much a pay-to-play kind of thing. Icon Stadium, which is where many, many high schools play their sports on Randall's Island, right? Icon paid to name that. Now we've sort of moved out of a system of honorific naming towards a pay to have your name on something.
Yeah, I guess, certain names are going to have value, and I guess, maybe we want to look for it from history to use a name, whatever, but I guess sometimes it's more like happenstance, right?
Yeah. Going back again to Rikers Island, so like, let's say if it goes through the closure and, it's changed to more renewable energy and focused on waste management, would you be for changing the name?
Yeah, I think it will definitely... The name of that island will be changed. I think that name is so associated with pain on so many levels. And in fact, the one of the laws in the Renewable Rikers trio of laws creates a committee to consider, among other things, renaming the island.
I guess the name you think would tie into maybe renewable energy, or would you happen to have any information on what that be?
Yeah, I don't know. My guess is that it'll be something about social justice and racial justice. That would be my guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess again to commemorate, right? This whatever happened on this island. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I like that. I mean, did you have any other topics to cover? Or?
No, I think like the main focus was mainly the Rikers because it has such a notorious history, and we also covered some other places. Just also like about the island. Is that the main bridge that's gonna stay there, or will they like expand it or make it more accessible, or is that something they're thinking? Or
I don't think so. I mean, there's one bridge. I think there will remain one bridge. Depending on what happens there may be barge traffic to the island. So if it does become a waste center, particularly if they're doing composting there, which is one of the possibilities that's being explored, they might move stuff in by barge. I don't know. It is right near LaGuardia Airport, so it's a little complicated because it's a high security zone, even without the jail.
But so, like, are we like certain that it will close, or since Mayor Adams is like saying to reconsider?
He's on the fence, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
could there be pushback, do you think?
I think I don't want to predict what the mayor's going to do. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of this mayor, but the Speaker of City Council, her last name is also Adams, Adrienne Adams, responded really quickly after the mayor floated the idea that maybe we need a plan B, saying, no, this is the law, we're closing it. And, the mayor on his own can't decide not to close Rikers Island because it's law.
Okay.
And he's tasked with taking care that the law be faithfully executed. He doesn't get to make law. His job is to administer it.
Okay. So him saying that we should reconsider closing it is what, like him maybe trying to pass a new law over it, maybe, or
it's him. It's really a trial balloon to see if he's got any support in city council for passing a new law. And I think the answer was really rapidly, no, you don't have support for that.
Okay, so people are really set on
closing it,
making sure it
Yeah.
goes down. Oh, that's good.
Yeah, interesting.
Okay.
I mean, there is one other maybe namesake that I'd like to discuss, and I think it's the Van Wyck Highway that also had a corrupt mayor behind the naming. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I know it's a little aside, but I kind of feel like talking about it.
No, I love talking about these people. So Van Wyck was the first mayor of unified New York. In 1896, Queens and Brooklyn joined with Manhattan and the Bronx to form one city. And incidentally, they joined because Manhattan had a really good water supply, and Brooklyn and Queens, as they were developing, didn't have reliable water. So that was sort of the main attraction for them to join with Manhattan, is to get access to that water supply. So Van Wyck was elected mayor, and he was a very, very corrupt politician. He entered the office of mayor, not a poor man, but not a rich man either. And then somehow, magically, he acquired 10,000 shares of American Ice, which was a trust back in the era before there was trust busting, right? American Ice Trust, which also somehow, we don't know how maybe, but it's pretty clear how, got a monopoly for unloading ice at the city's docks. And after Van Wyck got these 10,000 shares that he didn't pay for, and American Ice got a monopoly to unload ice, right, they promptly doubled the price of ice. And this was the era before refrigeration, and ice was a critical supply. And then so city council responded by passing a law to expand dock service so there could be more ships unloading ice to try to deal with the cost crisis, and Van Wyck prevented that from happening. So he was extremely. There are other major corruption scandals in his administration. He wasn't in office very long, but he left office a multimillionaire, having come in not poor man, but not a particularly wealthy man either. And in his obituary, which is usually the time people try to say something nice, the New York Times described him as the most corrupt mayor in New York's history, and that said that he oversaw an administration mired in ooze and muck. Now, he's had a lot of competition since then. I don't know if he'd still win most corrupt mayor in New York's history, but it's pretty significant that made it into his obituary.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay. So he had a reputation there.
Yeah.
So why did they decide to name the highway after him, if based on his history?
Yeah. Well, a lot of the roads that were built that are named were built by Robert Moses, who was the sort of master planner for New York. He built most of the highways, most of the parks, all of the pools. Right? He had unbelievable power in developing New York, and so he got to decide who things were named after. And there's this cohort that I sort of call bureaucrats with roads, and Van Wyck is one of them. I mean, you sort of, they're people that you look at and say, why on earth was anything named after this guy? I mean, this guy is super mediocre.
Right, yeah.
Van Wyck maybe is a little less than mediocre. But Robert Moses wanted to name it after him, and so be it. It's a horrible road, I might add, so there's some justice there maybe. It's a road that goes to JFK Airport, And when it was built, it, like so many of the other roads, was pitched as this will reduce congestion. This will make driving a pleasure, and it is full of congestion. It's a terrible, horrible road to take. When it was being built, other city officials begged Robert Moses to add light rail to the road because it was the 50s, or to at least get the right-of-way for light rail, and he refused because he didn't want people who didn't have private cars using his roads.
It seems like there could be like a bias here, right? If there's like only one person deciding these names, right? Robert Moses, if he was in, I don't know, cahoots with Van Wyck here, right? He easily get onto the name of the highway. Wow, that's weird.
Yeah, he had Robert Moses had a remarkable amount of power. He, very, very significantly fell from grace, and is now sort of villainized. But for a long time, he was... Well, there's a book written about him by Robert Caro called The Power Broker, and he was the power broker.
So he was this broker, like almost like, not a corrupt broker, but he was doing, bad things.
He did what he wanted.
Yeah. That's a better way to put it. Yeah. So it's interesting, right? Like we explored a few of the names here. One being this Van Wyck, and the other one being the Rikers Island. I'm sure there are others that I know you touch upon in your book, and I think we've kind of talked about a lot today. So we thank you for coming on, and we'd like you to, just tell us where we could find you, where you could buy your book, and tell us all that stuff.
Well, you can buy the book anywhere books are sold. I love saying that. You can buy it on Amazon if you want to buy it. You can buy it at Barnes and Noble. But if you have a local bookstore and you want to buy the book, I highly recommend go there and ask them. They can get it for you. It's much better if you support local businesses. You also could get it from your library if you don't want to buy it. If the library doesn't have it, they can get it, and you can read it that way. And you forgot about me. I'm on social media at rbratspies. Pretty much every kind of social media there is, except TikTok, because I'm too old for that. Just look for rbratspies and you'll see me. My website is just my name, RebeccaBratspies.com. There are links to all my work there.
Great.
Interesting stuff.
Yeah, so this is a great conversation. I think I appreciate the effort you put into doing all this research behind all these names, because I don't think many people have the patience for that.
But I think it's good.
It's good.
It's
really
good to look into the history, because we just take everything for granted. Of this is what it's called and this is what it is, but why? The why is important.
The why is important.
Yeah. Maybe like one last question regarding the naming of all these places and streets. What is it like about human names that people gravitate towards when it comes to naming cultural landmarks? Is there something, like emotional, or, for us, like, does it help to remember the past? What is it that we gravitate towards?
Yeah, one thing that's really interesting is most places don't name their highways. And that's really a New York thing. If you use the number for most of these highways, people would have no idea what you were talking about. The Major Deegan, the Bruckner, the Sheridan, the Ann Hutchinson, they have numbers, but I don't know what, I live here. I've lived here for decades. I have no idea what the numbers are, because the Jackie Robinson, we call them by their names. To some degree, I think it's a quirk, but it also... it's an interesting way to memorialize people. Like the Jackie Robinson Expressway goes to where the Dodgers used to play.
Yeah, makes sense that way. I know here in Quebec, right, we don't have names like attached to our highways. It's just, like you said, numbers, like the 15 North or whatever.
Yeah,
sometimes it does become a little hard to remember.
But we just call it the 15.
Yeah.
It almost becomes its own name.
Yeah, it's
the 15.
Yeah, right. The 15.
Yeah, I guess
another
that's
wonderful highway.
Maybe it's just easier also because people associate a name and it's easier to remember. So I guess there's that. But fascinating stuff, and we definitely would recommend people to get your book and learn more about the history of New York.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Thank you. It was really nice talking with you.
Thank you. Yeah, great.